Going to be talking about the God over the storm.
All right.
So we're going to start in Matthew chapter 26. We're going to start here. We're going to read it. And then we're going to move to something else and come back to it. But it says, Matthew 26, verse 20, it says, when evening had come, he sat down with the 12. Now as they were eating, he said, assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful. And each of them began to say to him, Lord, is it I?
Right.
And he answered and said, he who dipped his hand with me in the dish will betray me. The Son of Man indeed goes just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, who was in fact the one betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? And Jesus says back to him, you have said it. When it comes to the great world wars, especially World War II, there seems to be an endless amount of books, movies, articles that come out. Continually new stories are revealed that we had no idea about previously. In 2016, Hacksaw Ridge told us a story about Desmond Doss, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor despite refusing to bear arms during World War II on religious grounds. Doss was drafted and he was ostracized by his fellow soldiers for his pacifist stance, but he went on to earn the respect and adoration for his bravery, his selflessness, and his compassion after he risked his life without firing a shot to save 75 men in the Battle of Okinawa. In 2018, Operation Finale told us the story that 15 years after the end of World War II, a team of top-secret Israeli agents traveled to Argentina to track down Adolf Eichmann, who was the Nazi officer who masterminded the transportation logistics that brought millions of innocent Jews and their families to deaths in concentration camps. In trying to sneak him out of the country, Agent Peter Malkin soon finds himself playing a very deadly game of cat and mouse with this notorious war criminal. And I loved these stories. And these are true stories, by the way. Authors and directors, they find new stories to tell us, showcasing a new unsung hero or a team of heroes who, through their contributions, saved countless numbers of lives. We're retold the events of the heroic individuals risking their lives for the greater good, but no one tells you the story of the nerds and the difference that they made. No one tells you the story of the art majors, the museum curators, the middle-aged men and women who, because of their efforts, saved countless pieces of art. And that's the story that Robert Edsel wanted to share with us. He wanted to tell us about the soldiers who had bad backs, who once sat behind their museum solid wood desk and read important letters with tiny glasses. He wanted to tell us about those people who went halfway around the world to track down, find, and preserve priceless art. And so this is what they were called, the Monuments Men. Their work was largely forgotten to the general public until an art scholar, Lynn Nicholas, read an obituary about a French woman who spied on the Nazis' looting operation for years and single-handedly saved 60,000 works of art. Because among Hitler's many goals, one of them was to create a Führer museum, a museum that stood within Germany in its 1,000-year reign that showcased all the best that the world had to offer. And so the Nazis' war was not just restricted to the land and the seas and the fields and the skies, but to the churches, the museums, and the homes of the Jews. They would march into the homes with guns pointed and forcefully take all of the jewelry and the artwork. They would march into the churches and take the altar pieces, and they would leave and stash them in their storehouses among the mountains. Imagine never knowing about Michelangelo's Madonna sculpture, or the paintings of Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer, Seeing that the Nazis took control over France, so what about never even knowing that the Mona Lisa existed? It's kind of something you don't think about. But all of these pieces of art that are extremely well known could for us today simply not exist if we had not found them and got them before they were destroyed. There are many cities in Europe that, had it not been for World War I and II, would look extremely different today. Because total areas were turned to rubble, never to be rebuilt or look the same. Now, I've been fortunate enough to been to Prague, Czech Republic, and it's a city that was essentially untouched by the rampant bombing of the Second World War. And I've walked over the Charles Bridge, which is a medieval stone arch bridge that crosses over the Vltava River in Prague. It's 664 years old. It's incredible. It's an incredible sight. And I've been fortunate enough to been up on the castle on that hill, the Prague Castle. And it was built in 880. It sits on the hill of the city, and I've eaten dinner in the old Jewish quarter of the city, and it's incredible. It's an amazing experience. I've been to these incredibly rich historic places that in a lot of cities across Europe don't exist anymore. Right. And the reason that it still exists in Prague is because A, the Germans had very few military installations there. And B, the planes didn't really have the range to reach it. And so there are sites like these that naturally were not dramatically affected by the war. But then there are other sites all around Europe that, thanks to the monuments men, went either untouched or they were rescued. The monuments men took it upon themselves to go to the cathedrals and rope off the land around them and inform the army and its commanders that they were not able to bomb sites like these. Quite often, the army was already using the churches as outposts or medical sites or living quarters. But it was the monuments men who would drive up, and with their very little resources, they would have commandeered a half-broken Jeep or fallen apart motorcycle, and they would roll up in that janky old vehicle, and they'd go and tell the army commander, "You have to leave. This is an important site." And it was on one of those days that they were called in by the military to one of the cathedrals in the city, and they rolled up to the cathedral, and they were informed that the place had been trapped and tripwired by the Nazis during their retreat. And so the monuments men, they went into the cathedral, and as the city was in all of the commotion around them, it was tanks rolling by and fires needing to be put out from the firefight that had just taken place, and smoke was billowing in the sky, and gunshots off in the distance as the enemy retreated. As all the chaos happened around them, they walked into the cathedral, and they sat down on the pew, and they just looked. And they looked at the light coming in through the stained glass windows, and how the dust that had been stirred up created these beautiful beams of light. And they were just so overwhelmed and so overcome by the beauty and the peace in the midst of the chaos of the war. The war that had been raging for several years now. Many a man had lost their life, and ground had been won and lost. And in the midst of devastation and chaos and uncomfortability, on countless headaches, long nights of studying documents by candlelight, going over them and sleeping in the trenches after weeks of just pure exhaustion from just dealing with life and the war that they were in, they sat in that cathedral and they had peace. They didn't know whether or not they could disarm the bomb yet. They hadn't even examined it. It sat in their midst, and chaos was all around them. But in that moment of time, everything just stood still. And they had rest. Even though everything was a mess outside, when they sat in that cathedral, everything was okay. Right. And they experienced an hour of just pure, blissful peace. God promises us a perfect peace.
Yes.
He says you will
Yes.
keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you. Why? Because he trusts in you. God promised us a peace that surpasses all understanding. It says the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Now Matthew 14, it starts off with the story of John the Baptist being beheaded. Now it's not exactly a cheery intro to the chapter, nor was it, I expect, an easy thing for Jesus and his disciples to cope with. Matthew 14, verse 12, it says, Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and told what happened to Jesus. And then we kind of get to the next section where the headline reads, Feeding the 5,000. So we almost mentally separate the story.
Right.
But when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself.
Yeah.
And when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. That would have been a massive loss within the community of faith.
Yeah.
Having someone who foretold and was the forerunner to Jesus, he's now beheaded. That probably puts a little bit of stress and discomfort and unease into the group.
Right.
I'd say clearly by Jesus' reaction, he wanted a little bit of alone time to deal with the news that he just had to process.
Yeah.
He wanted to just be by himself for a little bit. And so he gets into a boat and he takes off to a deserted place. He just wanted to be by himself and deal with his emotions.
Yeah.
Jesus understands what we go through.
Yes, he does.
Because he's been through it himself. He's been through the loss and the suffering. And I'm sure we can all relate to what Jesus is experiencing here. We've experienced the loss of a loved one. Except maybe Jesus has the edge on us because his loved one is murdered. Not all of us have experienced a loved one who's murdered. Usually it's a natural passing. And so the crowd's life tracks him down. All the problems, all the stress, all the questions, all the people bugging him, track him down. And the circumstances are relentless. But Jesus, he doesn't push them away. He spends time with them, and he ends up feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But he still hasn't had his alone time. He got disrupted. And so immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Before he got in the boat, and he took off. And it didn't work, so he's like, okay, I'm sending all of you off. So he sends them off in the boat to go before him to the other side. And while he sent the multitudes away. So he sends his disciples off, and he's sending the crowd of 5,000 off. And when he had finally gotten rid of everyone, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was alone there. Jesus tries to get some alone time.
Yeah.
He tried it in the first place. He tried to go to a deserted place by himself, but the crowds found him out. Life found him out.
Right.
And it came and it pestered him again, and he had just lost a dear friend, and he just needed some time to deal and cope with it. He tried to go away and be alone, but life had just caught up with him. And life's like that sometimes, isn't it? It just doesn't leave you alone, and it just keeps doing these little small pricks and prods, and it just pesters you. And even though you're trying to take a moment to yourself and just process for a moment, it just keeps getting at you and keeps poking its finger at you. And sometimes it's not even anything that extreme that's coming at you, but it's just the fact that you can't get away for a moment. You don't have any time to rest and deal with what you've been going through. It's just the constantness of it. And so it gets to the point where Jesus has to send his disciples away, and he sends away all the crowd. He sends away everything that he can for the moment. And like the monuments men in that chapel, he's finally able to just have that alone time with God. He's able to have that chapel moment. He gets by himself, and he's finally able to pray. He's finally able to push out all the chaos that's surrounding him.
Yes.
And he's able to create a moment for himself where no one is bothering him with a request or a question. And he just has that quiet time with God. And it nourishes him. Mm-hmm. And it feeds him. And it gives him what he needs in the hours to come, as we'll see. Right. That moment in time that he spends alone gives him what he needs to take on the storm that's ahead.
Right. Yes.
Because when he had sent the multitudes away, he was alone and by himself, but all the disciples were together. And by the way, they're in the boat that Jesus put them in the middle of the sea now, and it's tossed by the waves because the wind was contrary. All the disciples are having a very bad time. I don't know how big the boat was, but it's certainly big enough to fill at least 12 people.
Yeah.
So a decent size, and it's being tossed by the waves. It's not a small, nice bag. No, it's getting thrown about. That means that these are some very big waves. This is a chaotic storm going on right now. And in verse 25, it says, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. So in the fourth watch, this is a decent amount of time being passed before the disciples get to see Jesus again. This is a lot of time to be tossed in the sea. That's a lot of scary hours that have passed. Right. Because the Roman military, they divided the night into 4 watches of 3 hours each, from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. So the fourth watch would have been 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Mm-hmm. And they've been in that boat since the previous evening. Yeah. So it's been at least 9 hours of getting thrown in the ocean. This is a chaotic time. This is frustrating and it's terrifying. And probably they don't know whether they're going to live or die and what's going to become of their lives. They don't know what's going to happen. They've been fighting this storm for 9 hours. And I imagine that Andrew and Peter and James and John, because they're the fishermen of the group, are shouting orders at the rest of the disciples, telling them what to do in the boat, telling the other disciples, who, by the way, consisted of extremely inexperienced sailors. You had a tax collector, a religious freak, and a thief. So they're not exactly the best adventure crew. And they're being absolutely smashed for 9 hours by the waves. The waves are roughing them up and beating them about and beating up the ship for 9 hours, and their hands probably began to bleed as they tried to row the oars and pull the ropes, because ship work is hard work, and it's rough, and it beats you up, and you're soaked through to the bone. Your clothes are soaked through, and you don't even know if you're sweating or not, but you're hot and you're tired, and you've been doing this for 9 hours. And it's exhausting. And surely they wondered to themselves, what is going on? Why are we even here? What are we doing out here in the middle of nowhere on this boat? Jesus sent us on the boat. What was he thinking? We wanted to stay with him, but no. We got to get on this boat. You think maybe he'd see this coming. Nice foresight, Jesus. Everything was fine back on land. Thanks a lot. And it's chaotic. And it's a mess. Some of the disciples are sweating. Others are praying. Probably at least one of them is crying. It's a nightmare. Because they're just trying to get through the night. And wave after wave is just crashing over them, turning them about. They don't even know their directions anymore. I don't even know if they can see the stars to navigate, but the waves are just crashing them down and knocking them around, and they wrestle to find their balance and get back to the oar and begin to row again. And as they go to grab hold of the oar and row again, behold, a ghost is walking out on the water. And so they began to get a little panic, because now we have a storm, but now we also have a ghost, and so let's paddle a little harder to try and get out of this area. And by the way, the ghost calls out to them and says, "Be happy, guys. It's me." "Thanks, ghost. Glad to see you too." What is going on here? By the way, the Bible's not said yet that the waves calmed down or that the wind stopped.
Right.
It's a pretty important detail. It gave us that detail in the first place, and it's not given us again, so the waves are still going crazy.
Yeah.
And now you got a ghost talking to you. The rain's pouring, and the wind is blowing, and the waves are still crashing over the boat.
Yeah.
And this figure says, "Be happy, guys. It's me." I don't know if this is a nightmare or a hallucination or if I'm passing into the afterlife at this point. It's a lot to handle. And here's the funny thing about reading the story, is that we get to know the details before the characters do. We get to know that it's Jesus speaking here,
Yeah.
not a ghost. We're given that detail before the ghost speaks. So we are kind of relieved as the readers to know that it's not actually a ghost. We know it's Jesus that called out to them.
Right.
Yes.
We're told it's Jesus, and so therefore sometimes we implicate that they know it's Jesus.
Yeah.
But they don't.
That's right.
They don't know who this ghostly figure is. We, the audience, we know because we read it, but they don't. They have no idea who this figure is. They're in a storm, and it's been chaos for 9 hours, and so for all they know, they're hallucinating from pure exhaustion and blood loss. And so when some ghost says, "Hey, it's me," what are the odds it's Jesus? If I'm a disciple on the boat, I'm saying pretty low.
Yeah.
And so Peter, I don't know why, maybe out of just pure exhaustion, he's not thinking very reasonably, but he says, "God, if it's you, then you tell me to come out and walk with you."
Yeah.
It's pretty bold. Maybe he thought he was in the afterlife, or maybe he just wanted to go there. I don't know. So he says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And
Right.
the figure replies, "Come."
Yeah.
He says to him, "Come." And Peter got down out of the boat. He starts walking on the water to go to Jesus, but then he looks up and he sees
Yeah.
and he remembers how boisterous that wind was
Yeah.
and how big those waves still are. And he's afraid. He begins to sink and he cries out, "Lord, save me." Peter, he gets out of the boat, and for a second, Peter has a cathedral moment. Because in the midst of the chaos and the storm that he's been battling for hours, here he is, walking on water.
Yeah.
And it's peace, and it's bliss, and it's amazement, and it's awe, and it's wonder, and all of these things are going through his mind, and it's wondrous joy as he's taking those steps on the water, but then he looks up from his steps on the water, and he looks up from that cathedral moment, and looks back at the storm that he's still in the middle of,
Right.
that he was just facing, and he once again realizes how chaotic things still are all around him. That the wind is still boisterous and blusterous, and the waves are still really quite big and coming over his head still. And so as he goes to take another step, this time it's not a step, but it's a splash, and he starts sinking down, and he cries, "Lord, save me." And Jesus, he reaches out immediately, and he grabs him, and as they stand there on the water together, Jesus asks him, "Why did you doubt me?
Yeah.
Why did you look back at the storm that I was helping you walk through?
Yeah.
We had it.
Yeah.
Why'd you look away? It was peaceful when you were with me. You had peace in that cathedral moment that we were having together, and you felt my presence, and we were getting through it together. I was helping you walk through the storm together, but then you look back at the storm.
Yeah.
And it got into you.
Yes.
And he walks Peter back to the boat. As they climb back in, as soon as Jesus steps foot on that deck, everything stops.
Right.
The wind stops.
Yeah.
The waves stop. And everything is completely still.
Right.
And Peter, he had just had his cathedral moment, but now everyone on the boat has a cathedral moment. Because they come and they worship Jesus and they say, truly, you are the Son of God.
Yeah.
You make order out of chaos. And in the middle of the storm, you bring peace. When I'm at my wit's end and I've been battling something for 9 hours that's supposed to be killing me, you come and you rescue me. You reign over all. Through you all things are created, and to you were all things created. You are truly the Most High. You are the Messiah. You are my God over the storm. Out of the chaos and out of the darkness, you brought me into your marvelous light. Time and time again, the disciples experience this phenomenon, this extraordinary happening of coming out of the chaos and into God's presence. And as time goes on, Jesus continually tells them, he continually tells the disciples that his time is drawing to an end, that his time is running out. And the disciples, they both do and do not understand this. They get it and they don't. And so as time draws near, he enters Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And Jesus, he's fervently been looking forward to eating this last meal with his disciples, his followers, his closest friends. Musicians, if you could come. Mark chapter 14, it says, in the evening he came with the 12, and as they sat and ate, Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, one of you guys is going to betray me. And it hurts them. And they're sorrowful. And they say to him, one by one, is it me? And they go around the room, is it me, Lord? Lord, is it I who's going to do it? Is it me, God? I've been following you. I've been with you for a long time. Is it me? And then he answers and he gives them a little hint. He says it's one of the 12 who's dipped his hands in the dish with me. Jesus, he gives them a hint. It's one of the 12. It's someone who's had the closest access to me. And no alarm bells are going off at this point yet as to who it is. Let's read Matthew's account. One evening had come, he sat down with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, assuredly, I say, one of you is going to betray me. And they say, Lord, is it me? And he answers them, he says, it's one of the 12. It's one of the one who dipped their hands in the dish with me. And then Judas, who was betraying him, he answered and said, Rabbi, is it I? To everyone else, he was Lord. Lord, is it me? They go around the room, Lord, is it me? God, I don't want to be the one who betrays you. You're my God. You're my Lord. And then it gets to Jesus, or it gets to Judas. Jesus hasn't replied yet. They've just gone around the room one by one asking, is it them? And then it's Judas's turn and he says, Rabbi, is it me? Because to Judas, he was just a rabbi. He was just a teacher. He was not the God over the chaos. And Jesus replies to Judas, you said it. He made no reply to anybody else but Judas. And this is where the room should erupt. If you think about it. This is when Peter should have drawn his sword and started making threats. This is when it should have happened. This is Jesus, the Messiah, the one that they've been looking forward to for thousands of years, and his traitor is in the room and nobody's reacting. This is the one who they spent their life with, and they've seen him perform countless miracles. And this is the one who's healed the sick and caused the blind to see. Yeah. This is the one who's raised people from the dead and has rescued them from that sea storm and has spoke to the wind and caused it to cease. Who spoke things into the existence that didn't even exist. Right. This is God, who's come down to them, and his traitor is in the room, and nobody moves. This is where chaos and hell should have unraveled themselves. This is where everything should have broken apart, and vengeance and anger should have sprouted forth in that room, and yet everybody just sits around as if nothing has happened. This is where Judas, the traitor, could have met his end. It could have happened here. We have zealous disciples in the room. And he's the traitor. And he just got told he was the traitor by God himself. But everything's okay. And no one seems to move. No one seems to burst into an outrage. No one fights him. No one challenges him or even treats him any differently. They just carry on with dinner. And Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. And after that, they sing a hymn together. Everything's peaceful. Everything's okay. At the point where everything should be breaking apart at the seams, everyone just sits around and has dinner. And it's all okay. Because it's in that middle of the storm, in the middle of God's presence, they're all surrounded by it. They're all there. And if there was any time there was a cathedral moment, this is it. Because Jesus looks this traitor in the face, acknowledges that it's him, and he's okay with it. And the disciples are looking at someone who is easily now classed as their enemy, as the one who is about to be the bringer of chaos into their lives. And they don't even have a problem with him. Why? Because they're in the presence of Jesus. Whenever Jesus shows up on the scene, things just kind of seem to level out. The closer that they got to Jesus, the less effect that their storms had on their lives. When they started to really turn their attention to God, everything else didn't matter so much. And they weren't struggling with anger. They weren't struggling with vengeance. And they weren't struggling with stress and all the questions that should be rolling around in their mind. But they just had a moment of peace with God. Do you need that moment of peace this morning? Do you just need to step into God's presence and say, God, I'm just getting beat up by the waves and the wind, and it's rolling around, and I just don't know what to do anymore. God, I just need you, and I need the peace that you offer. Let's stand together. If you need that peace that only Jesus can bring into your life, the peace that it doesn't make sense how everything is just okay, but the peace that says, God, I don't know what I'm even going through, but it's okay when I'm with you.